My job is Assistant Director for History and Culture at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. I lead the scholars, the historians, the curators at the museum who are in charge of producing the exhibitions, the books, a lot of the educational programs and symposiums, and work with a collection of about 824,000 objects. But I have a real interest in photography, and we have also over 500,000 photographs in the National Museum of American Indians Archive Center. So I've been working very hard in the year that I've been at the museum. I have a 30-year career at Smithsonian, but I've just joined the American Indian Museum in the last year. And these photographs are much interest to me at the Archive Center.
So you wrote an article about the collection. Tell us why you wrote this article, A Virtual Tour of History.
Thanks, Richard. We have a great magazine, American Indian Magazine, that is a members magazine for our museum. And I've become more and more familiar with it over time. So when I was asked to think about the opportunity to consider what photographs we have online for the public to see and for students to study online, it was a great opportunity because I was able to review and get really deep into all the collections of photography that are online, about 25,000 photographs of these, 500,000. We're continuing to work all the time to get more online. But for me to do a deep dive into everything we have now was just fantastic. That's what I love. I still love to do research, and for me to understand the depth of collections from the beginning of photography in the 1840s here in America to present day contemporary and digital. So I was asked to do an article about a virtual tour of photography online. And it really got me up to date with everything we have. Well, I can't physically get into that archive, which I so want to do. So what I could do was bring to our readers a glimpse of what they can find. When I did join the museum and got a quick and early tour of the Archive Center, I asked first about the earliest images because I really wanted to know how far the collection went back. I know that daguerreotypes, one of the earliest forms of photography invented by Louis Jacques Mundy Daguerre in France in 1839, was also very popular in the US. So by 1840 or so, we were seeing these images. This image on the screen of Dr. Peter Wilson was from the early 1850s in the Buffalo, New York area. And so when these incredible, expensive looking cases with these, 180-year-old images open up, it's always exciting to me. First of all, if you don't look at them right, they're a mirror image. So scanning them and even reproducing them is difficult. So this is an excellent image by our staff photographers. But capturing the image of this American Indian man who went on to become a doctor so early on in our nation's history, but in a time when you would think few leaders in the Native community would become accredited through university and become a doctor. But it shows you really a window back into a different time. And you want to learn more about who Dr. Wilson was and why he was dressed as he's dressed in Western attire and why he looks the way he does. And possibly, who did he give this image to? Was it something that he kept? Was it something that was shared with family? Or was it possibly meant for something else? But we spent a lot of time on provenance research, which is learning about the creation of an object or photograph, in this case, who made it, who is the sitter, and trying to find out just why it was made. So I wanted to go back right to the beginning and know that American Indians and our indigenous native populations here in the US and in the Western Hemisphere, they were being photographed. And what story does that tell? So it was a pleasure to find this image right away when I was searching online.
And then a lot of these pictures you have the back or the
Hmm.
inside. What is that?
Well, that's, that's unlocking history. That's when you're the history detective. When you open up the case and you see something like this with Peter Wilson's name, his name spelled out, uh, his native name, his American Indian name is there, which I will not try to pronounce because I don't want to do it injustice. And there it does. It says, gifted to his friend, P.E. Thomas. And it's actually through Thomas, I believe, that this image was donated to the National Museum of American Indian collection. And you have to remember, our collection is a century old, but our museum was only founded in 1989. So this, all of the early collection items that come in through the George Gustav High collection, the Museum of American Indian, that was based in New York City in particular. So, we have so many collections that have come in over the course of a century. And so it's taken us decades, and we continue to try and research and get the origins of the objects and the images that we have.
So next in your article, you have ambrotype.
So ambrotype comes into being in the 1850s, a wet collodion process on glass. And you can see they're fragile. You see part of, what I want to show to viewers is that, we do try to take the best care we can of our objects. We have conservation department. We take a lot of pride in keeping our collections in the best storage environment as possible. I work at the museum's Cultural Resources Center out in Suitland, Maryland, when we're open, not in these COVID times. And all of the images are stored there at the Archive Center. But you can see over time, an image from the mid, to late 1850s, goes through some wear and tear. And so the image is cracked. But we've tried to keep it in the best shape possible. So you see a man here in this image who is about 100 years old. And again, zooming in, you can get such detail from these early images. You see, there could be a stain there at the top, obscuring some of the image. But for what it's gone through in this century and a half, more than that, we're lucky to have it in the condition that it is. And this is an individual who fought in wars, probably in the War of 1812, and has lived a tough life potentially, but he was also part of some major decisions and treaties that were signed with the Native Americans. One in Michigan, one treaty ceding millions of acres of land to the U.S. government, and he was part of that. So recording the history, and again, having this window into history to be able to recognize and identify some of the individuals in these early photographs all the way up to today, really brings history full circle, and you can understand that these are individuals who had exceptional lives sometimes, or we learn a lot about day-to-day life in some of the photographs that we have.
There's also an extra thing with this photograph.
Mm-hmm.
What's that?
So sometimes we'll see these small clippings from newspaper articles about the individuals, talking about Chief Okemos and the long life, outlining his battles as he was involved in some of the wars, his life near Lansing, Michigan, and also outlining sometimes who made the photograph. This was photographed by Henry H. Smith in Michigan in 1858. And again, there weren't all that many photographers working that early. So to have it identified, both the sitter and the photographer is quite extraordinary.
The next thing you reference in your article chronologically is Alexander Gardner. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of photographs here, but what are we looking at here?
We're looking at a group of Crow Indians who participated in the signing of the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. They were hoping for reservation and land and rights to live in the Black Hills. Again, so many treaties have not come to fruition, but there was hope on this day. And this collection is just, expansive. It's about 200 images by Alexander Gardner. Gardner gained fame during the American Civil War, worked with the Matthew Brady Studio out of Washington, D.C., and many of the images that are very memorable from the Gettysburg battle and the aftermath of the soldiers, images of soldiers who had died during that battle are Gardner's work. Little was known about these photographs for many years. I mentioned earlier that I've spent 30 years studying photography at the Smithsonian, first at the National Museum of American History, and now at the National Museum of the American Indian. And this small collection, but significant collection, was unknown to many of us at the institution until the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, just in the last decade. And as we were researching collections, and I was chairing an editorial committee for a book on the Civil War collections at the Smithsonian, one of the archivists invited me over to the American Indian Museum to see this collection that I did not know about. Many of my fellow curators did not know about, and ended up that there was a retrospective of Alexander Gardner's work at our National Portrait Gallery. And for the first time, the American Indian Museum loaned photographs to another museum. So that was just astounding to me, to be able to think about these Gardner images, think about Gardner being part of the Civil War photography when we're first time Americans were seeing wartime photographs and published in books and then in newspapers and illustrated monthly journals. Then he travels with General Sherman west as the Indian Wars begin just after the Civil War. So from 1866 to 1868, Gardner's traveling with the general's troops and visiting the various sites, meeting these individual, Indians and visiting the tribal communities, being witness to treaty signings and the gatherings, and documenting for history what's happening as the wars move again from east to west with the Indian Wars that would go right up till 1890. But for that 2-year period, Gardner is photographing. And these were the images that were kept by General Sherman and then donated to the Smithsonian. So just thinking about that journey that was happening and the hard moment in American history that continued, going from the difficult times, getting through the Civil War, coming back together as the Union, and then launching right into war in the American West with the Indian tribes and trying to move through the treaty making. It was, again, a hard time, but Gardner's images capture it forever.
You selected this particular image as the kind of the banner for the lead into your article. What drew you to this one?
There were several types of images, and you can see at the top left of the screen a variety, 7 of the different images that are online for this collection. I wanted to show the specific group that was signing the treaty. Again, we have an exhibition called Nation to Nation at the museum, which I highly recommend people come to see when we are able to get open again. But it goes through the history of U.S. government treaties with Native American communities across the U.S. And, a lot of times those treaties were not fully executed. And I wanted to highlight the treaties within this. A couple of the images reference treaties and Gardner being present at that moment and showing the men who were there to to sign with the U.S. government was important for me to show within the article.
What do you suppose Gardner's purpose was? Did he make money with these photographs?
He was the first wartime photojournalist in America. Not in the world, but here in the U.S. And so he made his livelihood from photography. First, working for the Matthew Brady Studio, as I had mentioned, here in D.C. Then publishing a sketchbook of the Civil War and selling volumes of those. You can find those in museums at the Smithsonian Library of Congress, and a couple of museums also still have that 2-volume sketchbook that he produced. And then his images, would be sold, for use in news periodicals, journals, monthly journals, newspapers. So he was, for many years, very successful in his work.
The next photograph that you had in your article was this. Tell us what we're seeing here.
Okay, this is an image from the Frank Lehner collection of photographs from Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And I have done a lot of research on William F. Cody and Buffalo Bill's Wild West. In fact, my PhD dissertation is on the art and advertising of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And my interest in this area started from one collection at the American History Museum, which is a portrait collection of Sioux Indian performers from the Wild West. Gertrude Casimir photographed those images that I started out with. The American Indian images that are represented in the Lehner collection have a lot of behind the scenes photos, which I like to see. I like to see, what were the performers doing when they weren't in the arena. A different element of what was happening. Instead of the performers in the arena reenacting things like, Battle of the Little Bighorn or horse races and other types of program acts that would happen during a visit to the Wild West. Here's Cody sitting with a couple of the performers. I'm thinking it's possibly Chief Irontail at Cody's left, who performed for more than 20 years on the show circuit with Cody, traveling nationally and internationally with the show. Many of the performers were Sioux Indians from Pine Ridge Reservation. I had the opportunity with another Smithsonian colleague to visit Pine Ridge just 2 years ago, and to learn more about the families and the individuals who chose to leave the reservation and perform, whether it was one season or many seasons. There, lots of different reasons why an individual would choose to contract with the Wild West show. And I wanted to be able to show one of these images that highlighted that there was a relationship between Cody and the Indians, that he was hoping that this opportunity was not just a stereotypical look at Indian life, but was an education for the public. And some Indians chose to join him. And yes, they were sometimes reenacting scenes that they had lived, but they were also being paid. They were seeing the country and seeing the world, at least Europe, at times when the show would go there. And there were many personal reasons for an American Indian man or woman to join the show. The families could also travel with the show. And so women would be behind the scenes, taking care in the camp, teepees, were able to travel and live like they would, and also wear clothing as they would. And they weren't always allowed to do that when they were on the reservations in the US. So I wanted to highlight that one collection and also show that intimate moment behind the scenes and the engage and the friendship that did transpire between a lot of the Indian performers and Cody.
This category of photograph, I think you called silver gelatin.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
Sure, silver gelatin photographs become popular, especially through the Eastman Kodak Company from the late 1880s all the way up to digital, what we know up until the 1990s. You don't see too much photographic film available for sale these days, but the silver gelatin, and the salts that coat the photographic paper make those beautiful black and white images that we've known through time. And much of the history of the Wild West show were documented in the silver gelatin photographs from the 1890s to 1916, at least, when Cody was traveling with the show. But until color becomes popular in the 1930s, the silver gelatin is really primary, and it remains today a favorite of some artistic photographers as well, for photographs that we see. And throughout the archive here at the American Indian Museum, there are many distinctive silver gelatin collections.
In your article, then, the next category going in the history of photography is stereo. What are we seeing here?
Another popular type of image for many decades, from the 1850s all the way to the 1940s to the World War II era. What we see in this image is an inaugural parade, a presidential inaugural parade from the time of Theodore Roosevelt. So from 1905, here in the parade, we have at least 6 American Indian chiefs coming down Pennsylvania Avenue. Again, we're very familiar today with, potentially seeing this on television or here in DC. Many folks make it a tradition to go and watch that parade after the inauguration. And again, just seeing ever present in American life are our Native and Indigenous communities. And that's really at the heart of what we want to do at the National Museum of the American Indian, is to make sure that our public, our visitors, students and teachers understand the rich history of American Indians, pre-US all the way through US history to today. And being part of a presidential inauguration is about American as it gets, I think.
Is there a way for people to see these in stereo, or is that just something that's hard to do?
Some stereo enthusiasts do have that, opportunity through old-time viewers, handheld viewers. And I think there are some programs online. I'm sure you could search stereo photography and learn how you could do it with your laptop at home or your iPad. Do a little searching to see how you can really see the three-dimensional reality of what those images side by side can bring, and it's really fun to see them as the photographer hoped you would see them.
This is another category that you address in your article. Tell us about this.
So there are some subjects that I think we even need to investigate and research more and bring onto our exhibition floors and into online exhibitions. And that's the history of American Indian boarding schools in the US. And this postcard photograph is from the 19-teens, I believe, 1914. And it's showing nurses at the Carlisle School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, inoculating students. And of course, just after this time would be another worldwide, epidemic of the flu in 1918. But here in the dispensary at the hospital, you can see that the health and welfare of the students, was being taken care of. But there's a long history from the late 1870s to the 1960s, and even some Indian schools persist today outside the reservation system for educating American Indians. And, there's a tough history there, a complicated history, and these postcards, again, attest to that history and the groups, the young children here shown at this Indian training school photo. Beautiful color images. Again, these are real photo postcards. You can see in the upper left of the screenshot that the reverse, you can, share a memory, talk about the schools, send this to a friend or a family member. And reading, what folks are writing on the back of these postcards is also fascinating. Here's a training room, a sewing room at the Indian School for girls. There's also images that I've seen on some of these postcards of kitchens and cooking that happens at the school. Lots of athletics and teams also were part of school life. And again, these were individuals, children who were separated from their families, sent to live and learn to assimilate and to wear Western clothes, Western hairstyles. And it's it's a tough history, as you can imagine, for these students to be separated from Native ways, Native culture, Native ceremonies. But there are ways that they also chose to succeed and excel here in the band. And military skills were also gained at the schools. And these historic images, are a way for us to research that and for us to include in exhibitions that we consider around the schools as well.
So while we're at this page, could you walk us through this information for people who are exploring photographs online? What is this over here?
Okay, so if you look at the Smithsonian Online Virtual Archives, it's one of the sites online that I recommend for you to find thousands of interesting photographs. You're going to see the fields that our archivists complete as they enter information in. We try to enter in as much information as we possibly can into these online collections. So you'll see the series title with Indian boarding schools, the collection title, so you can know who donated the image. This Dale Jenkins postcard and photograph collection, holds many, many postcards like this. You'll see the image name and the date. The image name is going to clue you in, as is the number at the bottom, to how our archivists can pull those should you want to use it in a book, or if you have a website that you want to use it on or publish in an article. You're going to need to have that detailed image number information. And these images that you see online are not usually not restricted by copyright. Most of the time, they're so old, they're historic, and there are no copyright restrictions still on them. But all of that information that goes into documenting for our cataloging also then appears when you pull it up online in SOVA, which is this, again, Smithsonian Online Virtual Archives. And there's also an opportunity, you can see there's a PDF button that you can click on, and then you can download all this information and save it if you like, print it out, use it for future research.
Thank you. So the next category of photograph you had was this, I don't know how to characterize this, the Anne Bromberg photograph collection?
Again, Anne Bromberg is a working photo journalist and working in documentary photography. She's using black and white silver gelatin here in 1996 to photograph Dorothea Begay, a sheep herder in Navajo country. She is Dene, which is the word for Navajo that American Indians use. And so she is a sheep herder. You can see there are multiple images that Bromberg donated to the museum and captures different aspects of Begay's day as a sheep herder and everyday life. The opportunity for our museum to bring to the forefront that a contemporary woman like Dorothea, is living as she is here. The Native knowledge that is then shared from generation to generation of how life on the reservation goes, how farming goes, and the sheep herding is captured very beautifully in Bromberg's photographs.
So then the final category of photograph in your article was the National Congress of American Indians. Tell us about that.
Well, this really represents a lot of 20th century history, and I'm becoming more and more interested to bring that history forward, that 1890s forward, when the Indian Wars end in 1890 and we push into the 20th century, there is such leadership to bring Indian citizenship to the forefront in 1924, all the way to 1975 with the movement for self-determination and sovereignty, for tribal leadership. The National Congress of American Indian, these thousands of photographs that are in the archive at the National Museum of American Indian, represent a who's who of American Indians, of events, of moments that are happening, and much of it in the 1960s and 70s. There we are seeing pageant winner from one of the events at the Congress. But you'll see men and women and students who are very active in American Indian life, on the reservation, coming to Washington, really moving forward what some of the treaties had not accomplished earlier, which was sovereignty over land, and the leadership of their own tribe and communities. You'll see many museums and cultural institutions arise in the latter part of the 20th century. Our museum is working to connect with tribal leaders, tribal communities, to share the history of the objects we have, the photographs that we have, and having something like this collection where we see the evolution of Native American life and the influence on America is just, again, exceptional is a word I use often with the gems of these collections in the archive. And again, the who's who, meeting with President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy, President Nixon, and I'm learning so much about the Nixon administration and how that Self-Determination Act came into law in 1975. And so here we have, again, in Hyannisport, meeting happening with the Kennedys, governors from around the country. This is Governor of Michigan, and leaders, Frank George, I believe, from the National Congress of the American Indian. We've got a lot of research to do. And the 70s, they're almost 50, they're 50 years ago now. And I think that I'm very interested to see that the museum utilize these photo archives to make them available online, to bring them into stories that we do digitally online. And that's certainly a big push right now, because while so many people are at home and can't get into the museum, can't get to research with us in person, we want to make sure that these collections are available. And the National Congress of American Indian, thousands of photographs to learn about history in the latter part of the 20th century.
So if someone is watching this and they want to explore this collection, it's a little bit overwhelming when you think about the number of pictures. Mm-hmm. So is this where you begin?
Richard, when you search online, sometimes it's always a grab bag. You want to get to where you want to be. But sometimes, searching at smithsoniancollections.si.edu or going onto that Smithsonian Online Virtual Archive, sometimes you hit the mother lode and you hit thousands of images and you click through and you find some things that you didn't expect. Like I did when I was able to get onto SOVA and search the 220 collections that the American Indian Museum Archive has up and available right now. And I was fascinated. I took hours just scrolling through. And you can do that online with Smithsonian. If you go to collections.si.edu, and you'll see on the left side, you can do an advanced search. You can type in words that are meaningful to you, to your family, to research, and begin to scroll and see thousands of options. If you want to look at the Anne Bromberg collection, go ahead and type that right in. If you want to learn about Wild West shows, you want to learn about President Nixon and American Indians, you can do all that and find searches that hopefully satisfy your need. But you're going to find a lot more to learn from at the same time, because again, we know when you do a really generic search, you're going to get some really big surprises. And hopefully when you're looking at all these images that come up as you modify your search online, You're going to learn about American Indian life, historic and contemporary, and you're going to see these incredible stories of the men and women and the children who have survived, who have persevered. During these times of COVID-19, you can read online and you can search for the tough times that are being had on reservations across the country. And we do study the Western Hemisphere. So we also study, Canadian First Americans, indigenous populations in Latin America and South America, as well as the US. And so right now we're thinking about how do we search online and how do we find the stories that will become part of the archives in the future. So we're very active right now, and we continue to reach out to communities and interact with communities to know that this history is important. American history through the lens of American Indian history is American history.
Tell us about how the pandemic has affected your work and your job.
So this 2020 pandemic, we have been closed as a Smithsonian. The institution closed March 16th, and we are only just now about to open a couple of the sites, the zoo, the National Zoo, and the National Air and Space Museum. The Udvar Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia, will open on July 24th. We've been closed for a long time, and I know our secretary, Lonnie Bunch, is very disappointed to have shuttered our doors and not been able to serve the public as we have for 174 years in Washington and around the world. Especially, we have a museum of the American Indian in New York as well, and that's been closed specifically during the critical times in New York and now. But we've been working from home. We are teleworking for the foreseeable future, because even when those museums open, I don't think many of us will be back in our offices right away. So we've been taking inquiries. We've been trying to share information. I think that's why the information that's online, our collections online, and specifically these photographs we've been talking today, it's so important for folks to know that they can learn while we're closed, and we can expand the digital offerings. Also at the museum, we have online Native Knowledge 360, which is teacher curriculum that focuses on American history throughout American history. So we can right some of the wrongs, some history that hasn't made it into textbooks over time. And looking at Native Knowledge 360 is another way to search online at our website. AmericanIndian.si.edu is where you'll find it, or you can search for Native Knowledge 360. And many of the images, like we've been talking about today, are embedded in the curriculum that you find online. So we've been trying to become that digital museum that we've always wanted to be. And now we have that with these uncertain and unfortunate times in COVID. And we've also been wanting to be very respectful of what's happening in American Indian country right now. And so we are also collecting digitally and thinking about what objects to collect in the future. That's different for our museum. We have not collected current history in this way before, although some other Smithsonian museums have American history during the September 11th tragedy, and Black Lives Matter collecting with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, American history in our Anacostia Museum. So there's active work happening, even though most of us are sitting in our living rooms, doing our work at our dining room or in our offices at home. And we'll continue to do that and try to bring new projects to life, even as we stay safe.
One last thing is the February 25th Smithsonian launched Open Access, 3 million images that are public domain. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, open access has been something that Smithsonian's wanted to do for many years, and many museums around the country and the world are offering free and open access for use of images. We also do a lot of 3D imaging at the Smithsonian, and so you can also have rights to all the files for those. If you have a 3D printer, even better. So open access is something that every unit is committed to. There are many sacred and ceremonial images and objects in our museum, so we're more limited in what we can put up online right now, but we keep researching for how we can satisfy these open access highlights and requirements so that we can become more visible through open access. But you can search through open access all the collections at Smithsonian and find images that you can use for personal use, for publication. If there are any copyright issues, you know, they're outlined as well. But open access is meant for free use and with no fees. As part of being American, you know, these are your collections. That's why it's so important for us to keep on becoming more accessible.
Well, Michelle Delaney, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.